On August 15, 2021, the world watched in disbelief. Kabul, a city of 5 million people, fell without a single shot fired in its defense. The Afghan president had fled the country. US and NATO forces scrambled to evacuate. And the Taliban, the same group driven from power 20 years earlier by the most powerful military alliance in history, walked back into the presidential palace. How did this happen? How did a guerrilla movement, hunted through mountains and caves for 2 decades, manage to outlast a $2 trillion war and reclaim an entire country? This is the real story.
To understand how the Taliban came back, you have to understand how they first came to power and what America chose to ignore. Afghanistan in the 1990s was a country destroyed by war. First by the Soviet invasion that began in 1979, then by the brutal civil war that followed when the Soviets left. Warlords carved the country into bloody fiefdoms. Rape, extortion, and murder were daily realities for ordinary Afghans. Into that chaos, in 1994, emerged the Taliban, literally meaning students, mostly young men from Pashtun villages and refugee camps in Pakistan, educated in conservative Islamic madrasas. They presented themselves not as conquerors, but as restorers of order. And for a population exhausted by years of violence, many Afghans welcomed them. By 1996, the Taliban controlled Kabul. By 1998, they held nearly 90% of the country. Their rule was brutal. Public executions, the erasure of women from public life, the destruction of ancient monuments. But for a shattered society, they had delivered one thing the warlords never could: a kind of order. Then came September 11th, 2001. The American response was swift and overwhelming. Within weeks, US Special Forces, CIA operatives, and Northern Alliance fighters had shattered Taliban control. By December 2001, Kandahar, the Taliban's spiritual capital, had fallen. The Taliban regime collapsed with stunning speed. But here is the critical detail that history books often gloss over. The Taliban didn't surrender. They melted away. Senior commanders crossed the border into Pakistan. Mid-level fighters returned to their villages, and crucially, Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, the ISI, helped key Taliban leaders find sanctuary. Quetta, a Pakistani city just across the border from Kandahar, became home to what intelligence analysts would later call the Quetta Shura, the Taliban's leadership council in exile. The Americans knew, and for years they did relatively little about it. Why? Because Pakistan was a critical ally in the broader war on terror. The US needed Pakistani cooperation for supply routes, intelligence, and regional stability. So a degree of looking the other way became, quietly, American policy. While Washington celebrated its swift victory, the Taliban were regrouping, rearming, and waiting. By 2003, the first signs of resurgence were unmistakable. Roadside bombs, targeted assassinations of Afghan officials, attacks on NGO workers. The Taliban were back, not as a government, but as an insurgency. And insurgencies, as history has shown again and again, are extraordinarily difficult to defeat. The US compounded the problem by invading Iraq in 2003, diverting enormous military and intelligence resources away from Afghanistan at precisely the moment the Taliban were rebuilding. Afghanistan became the forgotten war. By 2006, the Taliban had re-established control over significant parts of Helmand and Kandahar provinces. NATO took over command of operations in the south and was shocked by the ferocity of the fighting. British, Canadian, and Dutch troops found themselves in their most intense combat operations since the Second World War.
The Taliban had a strategy, and it was devastatingly simple. They didn't need to win battles. They just needed to make the war too costly, in blood and treasure, for the Western coalition to sustain indefinitely. They had time. The Americans had elections. In 2009, newly elected President Barack Obama ordered a surge, sending an additional 30,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan, bringing the total to roughly 100,000. The goal was to reverse Taliban momentum, build up Afghan security forces, and create conditions for a political settlement. And tactically, the surge achieved results. Taliban gains were rolled back in key areas. High-value targets were eliminated, including, in 2011, Osama bin Laden in neighboring Pakistan. But the surge came with an exit deadline attached. Obama announced from day one that the surge troops would begin withdrawing in 2011. The Taliban noticed. And here is where the deeper rot became impossible to ignore. The Afghan government that the United States had spent billions building was, in large parts, catastrophically corrupt. Police checkpoints were extortion rackets. Government contracts enriched warlords. Soldiers were paid wages that commanders pocketed. The Afghan army had entire ghost units, soldiers who existed only on paper, their salaries stolen by officers. When ordinary Afghans compared the Taliban's harsh but predictable justice to the corruption and abuse of the government, for many, the choice was not as clear-cut as Washington imagined.
The pivot that made everything else possible came under President Donald Trump. In February 2020, the United States signed the Doha Agreement directly with the Taliban, notably without the Afghan government present at the negotiating table. It was a humiliation Kabul would not forget. The deal committed the U.S. to withdrawing all forces by May 2021 in exchange for Taliban guarantees not to harbor international terrorist groups and to engage in peace talks with the Afghan government. The Taliban signed, then methodically violated the spirit of the agreement while technically adhering to its letter. They stopped attacking American forces, as promised, but attacks on Afghan forces continued and accelerated, and the peace talks with the Afghan government went nowhere, by design. The message was sent and received across Afghanistan. America was leaving, and it was leaving on Taliban terms. Afghan soldiers and police, watching this unfold, began asking themselves a very rational question. Why die for a government that America just abandoned at the negotiating table? When President Biden took office, he confirmed the withdrawal, pushing the deadline to September 11, 2021, before settling on August 31st. What followed was not a military defeat. It was a psychological and political collapse. The Taliban launched a coordinated offensive in the spring and summer of 2021, capturing provincial capitals with breathtaking speed. Zaranj fell on August 6th, then Sheberghan, Kunduz, Herat, Ghazni, and city after city, the pattern was the same. Afghan commanders negotiated surrenders. Some were paid off. Some calculated that resistance was hopeless. Some simply believed no one was coming to help them. The Afghan army, 300,000 strong on paper, trained for 20 years, equipped with American weapons, essentially dissolved. On August 14th, the Taliban entered Jalalabad without a fight. On August 15th, President Ashraf Ghani boarded a helicopter and fled the country. Taliban fighters entered the presidential palace that evening. The 20-year war was over in days.
Analysts, generals, and politicians have spent years debating what went wrong. The honest answer is many things. But several factors stand above the rest. First, legitimacy. The Taliban, whatever their brutality, had roots in Pashtun tribal society, religious networks, and a genuine grievance narrative about foreign occupation.
The Afghan government they opposed was widely seen as corrupt, foreign-installed, and indifferent to ordinary people's lives. Second, sanctuary. Without the safe haven in Pakistan, the Taliban insurgency would have been far harder to sustain. This was arguably the single greatest strategic failure of the entire war, allowing the enemy a permanent refuge just across the border. Third, time horizon. The Taliban's most famous saying is attributed to a senior commander. "You have the watches, we have the time." Democracies fight with election cycles. The Taliban fought with generations. Fourth, the corruption of the state. No amount of military power can substitute for a government that people are willing to fight and die for. The Afghan state, for all the genuine sacrifices of many within it, failed that test. Fifth, the Doha Agreement. Negotiating directly with the Taliban, bypassing the Afghan government, effectively signaled to every Afghan that the US had already decided the outcome. The images from Kabul airport in August 2021 shocked the world. Thousands of Afghans pressing against the gates, men clinging to the outside of aircraft as they taxied down the runway. The chaos of the final evacuation and the devastating suicide bombing at Abbey Gate that killed 13 US service members and nearly 200 Afghans. Today, the Taliban govern Afghanistan once again. Women have been barred from education beyond 6th grade and from most forms of employment. Civil society has been crushed. Independent media barely exists. Afghanistan has become, in the words of UN experts, the most repressive country in the world for women and girls. The humanitarian situation is catastrophic, with millions facing food insecurity and the economy in free fall after international aid was cut off. And the geopolitical consequences ripple outward. America's credibility among allies was shaken. China and Russia drew lessons. And in capitals from Taipei to Kyiv, leaders quietly asked themselves, what does an American security guarantee really mean? The story of the Taliban's return is not simply a story of military failure. It is a story about the limits of military power, the centrality of political legitimacy, the dangers of flawed strategy, and the resilience, however dark, of movements rooted in a society that outsiders never fully understood. 20 years, $2 trillion, nearly 2,400 American lives, tens of thousands of Afghan lives, soldiers, civilians, women trying to build a different future. And in the end, the Taliban walked back in. History will debate the decisions that led here for decades. What is not debatable is the cost, paid most heavily by the Afghan people themselves, who now live under the rule of the very government the world spent a generation trying to prevent. This was the real story of the Taliban's return to power. If this video gave you a deeper understanding of what happened, subscribe, share it with someone who wants the full picture, and drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think was the single biggest mistake of the 20-year war? I'll see you in the next one.